Imagine this. The single most important event in the history of a world religion happened about 1400 years ago. But the first detailed account of what actually happened wasn't written down until 150 years later. 150 years. That's roughly the same distance in time as from the American Civil War to today. Now imagine that nobody wrote down anything about Lincoln, about Gettysburg, about any of it. And then, a century and a half later, someone sat down and tried to piece the whole story together from oral traditions passed down generation to generation. How reliable would that story be? This is the exact problem historians face when they study the origins of Islam, a religion with nearly 2 billion followers worldwide, a faith that shaped civilizations from Spain to Indonesia, a religion whose mosques line the skylines of thousands of cities across every continent. Tonight, we're not going to tell the story of Islam the way your textbook tells it. We're going to tell it the way historians have been debating it for decades. A story about evidence, about questions, and about the enormous gap between what happened and what was written down. To understand what we're about to explore, you need to understand one basic principle of how historians work. The closer a written record is to the event it describes, the more weight scholars give it. Think about ancient Greek history. Thucydides wrote about the Peloponnesian War while he was alive during that war. He was both an observer and a recorder at the same time. Tacitus, the Roman historian, wrote about the Roman Empire as someone living in that era. These are what scholars call contemporary sources. But for early Islam, the situation is completely different. The Prophet Muhammad died in 632 CE in the city of Medina. But the first complete biography we have of him is the Sirah, compiled by a historian named Ibn Ishaq, who was born in Medina around 704 CE. About 70 years after the Prophet's death. Ibn Ishaq spent his entire life traveling across the Islamic world, from Medina to Alexandria to Kufa to Baghdad, collecting oral accounts and interviewing descendants of the Prophet's companions, before compiling his work in Baghdad under the patronage of the Abbasid dynasty. He died around 767 to 770 CE. That means his work was composed roughly 120 to 130 years after the Prophet's death. But it doesn't end there. Ibn Ishaq's original manuscript is lost. What survives today is a revised version edited by another scholar named Ibn Hisham, who died in 833 CE. Ibn Hisham himself admitted that he cut, added, and modified parts of the original text. So the oldest biography of the Prophet that we can actually read today passed through at least 2 authors' hands and was written more than 200 years after the events it describes. The question is, during that 150 years of silence, what happened to memory? To answer that, you need to understand what sources we actually have. They fall into 2 big categories. The first category is Islamic literary sources, the Sirah, the Hadith or sayings of the Prophet, and Tafsir or Quranic commentary. Most of these were compiled and edited during the 2nd to 3rd centuries of the Islamic calendar, which corresponds roughly to the 9th and 10th centuries CE. The second category is contemporary sources, things that the era left behind directly, without later editing. Coins minted by the Caliphate, inscriptions carved into stone, ancient Quran manuscripts written on animal skin, papyrus documents from Egypt, and accounts written by non-Muslims, whether Syriac Christian priests, Armenian writers, or Greek historians. Here's the interesting part. These two categories don't always tell the same story. In some places they line up, in others they contradict each other, and in many areas the contemporary sources are completely silent on events that the Islamic sources describe in elaborate detail. Professor G.R. Horting from the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, one of the historians who studied early Islam for nearly half a century, once observed that we don't have a biography of the Prophet, no tafsir, no Islamic legal text, no hadith collection that can be confidently dated before the early 3rd century of the Islamic calendar. For those unfamiliar with the Islamic calendar, the early 3rd century corresponds to roughly the mid-9th century CE. That's over 200 years after the Prophet's death. But while Islamic literary sources were still silent, outsiders were already writing about the Arab conquerors as early as the mid-7th century. Robert G. Hoyland, a historian who compiled these accounts in a book called Seeing Islam as Others Saw It, showed that the writings of Syriac Christians, Armenians, and Greeks from the 7th and 8th centuries paint a picture that sometimes matches and sometimes diverges from the traditional Islamic narrative. There's another fascinating observation. Albrecht Noth and Lawrence Conrad, two scholars who studied early Muslim conquest narratives, discovered something surprising. Accounts of the conquest of different cities, whether Damascus, Cairo, or Cordoba, follow an eerily similar pattern. In each story, there's a traitor inside the city who points out a weakness in the walls. There's a festival or celebration that distracts the garrison. Then, soldiers climb the walls, shout praises to God, and open the gates from inside. The stories repeat like a literary formula, a template that storytellers use to fill in details for events they weren't present for, rather than actual records of different events in different places. None of this means the traditional narrative is fiction, but it does mean we have to read it carefully, the same way historians read any source written long after the actual events. In academic circles, this debate splits into two main camps. The first is called traditionalist, scholars who accept the Islamic sources in broad strokes. They believe that even though the records were written later, the core of the story is reliable, because Arab society of that era had a powerful culture of memorization, strict systems of oral transmission, and chains of narration that could be traced back. The second camp is called revisionist. These scholars push back harder. They insist on prioritizing contemporary evidence and argue that we can't accept records written 200 years after the events without serious questions, especially when those records were written under the shadow of political powers that had their own reasons for shaping the story in a particular direction. But between these two poles, there's a middle ground. Robert Hoyland, who was a student of Patricia Crone, one of the most prominent revisionist scholars, proposed that both the camp that accepts all the traditional sources and the camp that rejects all the traditional sources go too far. The best approach is to use contemporary evidence like coins, inscriptions, and outsider accounts as the framework, and then carefully fill in details from the Islamic sources. Like an archaeologist using a skeleton as the foundation, then slowly reconstructing the face from the evidence available. What's important to emphasize is that asking academic questions is not an attack on faith. Muslim and non-Muslim scholars alike participate in this debate. They don't want to destroy anyone's belief. They simply want to understand what actually happened during one of the most pivotal moments in human history. Because in the end, What matters isn't the answers, it's the questions. Honest questions are the starting point of real understanding. And admitting that we don't yet know everything is its own form of intellectual courage. Whatever the final answers turn out to be, the journey of searching for them has value in itself. If the records written later can't be trusted unconditionally, one thing we can do is look around. Look at the world where Islam was born. A world that wasn't an empty stretch of sand like many people imagine, but a land filled with civilizations, religions, and two superpowers that were burning themselves to the ground in a war that seemed like it would never end. The landscape of that era might tell us more than we think. In the 6th century CE, the Arabian Peninsula wasn't some remote wasteland cut off from the outside world, as many people imagine. If you stood on a hilltop in the Hejaz and looked north, you'd see the horizons of two of the most powerful empires the world had ever known. To the northwest was the Byzantine Empire, the direct heir of the Eastern Roman Empire, a land of domed churches, Roman law, and emperors who claimed to be the guardians of Christianity. To the northeast was the Sasanian Persian Empire, a realm of sacred Zoroastrian fire, palaces adorned in silver and gold, and the most fearsome armoured cavalry in the ancient world. The Arab tribes didn't live in a vacuum. They lived right in the middle of the magnetic field between these two poles of power. And this is the first key to understanding the origins of Islam. Modern scholars, including Fred Donner, Peter B. Ritzma, Professor of Near Eastern History at the University of Chicago, agree on one essential point. You cannot understand Islam by looking at it only within an Arabian context. You have to see it in a much wider frame, what historians call late antiquity. What is late antiquity? It's the transitional period between the ancient world and the Middle Ages, roughly the 3rd through 8th centuries CE. It was an era when the political map of the world was being redrawn. The Roman Empire had collapsed in the west, but survived in the east as the Byzantine Empire. Christianity was spreading across the Mediterranean, Judaism was adapting after the loss of the Temple in Jerusalem, and Zoroastrianism was still the state religion of the Persian Empire. Every religion, every belief system was competing for the souls of the people. In this environment, the Arabian Peninsula was anything but sealed off from outside currents of thought. Quite the opposite. It was deeply penetrated by religious ideas from the surrounding lands. Christian communities of various denominations had settled across Arabia, from the city of Najran in Yemen to the shores of the Persian Gulf. Large Jewish communities thrived in Yemen and in Yathrib, the city that would later become known as Medina. Even Zoroastrianism had influence in the eastern parts of the peninsula. And then there was another intriguing group. People the Islamic sources call Hanifs, Arabs who believed in one God on their own terms, without being either Christian or Jewish. They were living proof that the idea of monotheism wasn't something brand new in Arabia. It had been floating in the air long before Islam was born. More importantly, before Islam, the Arabs were not uncivilized nomads without structure. Well-organized Arab kingdoms had existed for centuries. The Ghassanid kingdom in the northwest was an ally of the Byzantine Empire and practiced Christianity. The Lakhmid kingdom in the northeast was allied with the Persian Empire. These kingdoms had states, writing cultures, systems of governance, and a flourishing tradition of poetry. The Arabs didn't start building civilization when Islam arrived. They already had one. Now, let's talk about the city at the heart of the traditional narrative, Mecca. In the traditional story, Mecca was a major commercial hub on the caravan route, a crossroads between the Mediterranean world and the Indian Ocean. A city that grew wealthy from the trade of spices, incense, and luxury goods. But in 1987, a scholar named Patricia Crone published a book that shook the academic world. It was called Meccan Trade and the Rise of Islam. Crone asked a straightforward question. If Mecca was really such a major international trading center, why did Greek and Roman sources, which were familiar with other Arabian port cities, almost never mention it? Why were there no trade records from that era confirming that Mecca was the commercial powerhouse the later Islamic sources claimed it to be? To be clear, Crone wasn't denying that Mecca existed. She never said it wasn't real. What she questioned was whether 6th century Mecca had the kind of economic importance that later Islamic sources attributed to it, or whether Mecca's greatness was written in retrospect to match the stature of the birthplace of the prophet of a great religion. Of course, not everyone agreed with Crone. Many scholars pointed out that she set the bar too high. The fact that Greek and Roman sources didn't mention Mecca doesn't mean Mecca was unimportant. You have to remember that the Greeks and Romans saw the world from the Mediterranean. They noticed coastal ports, but didn't necessarily see cities deep inland. Mecca's trade may have been regional rather than intercontinental. Not quite the picture the traditional narrative paints. But that doesn't mean it was insignificant. But regardless of how wealthy Mecca was, there was another external factor that mattered just as much. What was happening to the north of the Arabian Peninsula? In 602 CE, the final war between the Byzantine Empire and the Sasanian Persian Empire erupted. It started with a coup in Constantinople, when a general named Phocas overthrew and murdered Emperor Maurice. This gave the Persian king Khosrow II, who had been Maurice's ally, the excuse to declare war. What followed was catastrophic. The Persian armies swept in like a flood. Syria fell in 613. Jerusalem was captured in 614. Persian soldiers destroyed churches, looted the city, and carried the true cross, the relic Christians believed Jesus was crucified on, back to the Persian capital as a war trophy. Egypt, the most important breadbasket of the Byzantine Empire, collapsed in 618. It looked like the Eastern Roman Empire was finished. But then Emperor Heraclius, who had come to power in 610, launched a desperate counter-offensive. Starting in 622, he led his armies deep into Persian territory, destroyed sacred Zoroastrian fire temples, and finally crushed the Persian military. The war ended in 628. Heraclius returned the true cross to Jerusalem around 629 to 630, to the jubilation of Christians across the empire. But that victory was hollow. 26 years of war had devastated both empires beyond recovery. Armies lost massive numbers of soldiers. Economies collapsed. Border cities were depopulated from war and plague. The Persian Empire immediately fell into civil war after the conflict ended, with no fewer than 6 claimants to the throne in just a few years. The Byzantine Empire maintained stability, but its authority in distant provinces like Syria and Egypt was severely weakened. Both superpowers were like two boxers who'd beaten each other unconscious, collapsing at the same time. And right at that moment, the armies from the desert arrived. Just a few years after Heraclius celebrated his triumph in Jerusalem, Arab armies began advancing from a direction nobody expected. Syria, Palestine, Egypt, Iraq, all fell to the newcomers in less than 2 decades. The Sasanian Persian Empire was completely destroyed. The Byzantine Empire lost more than half its territory. Traditional history often presents this as a miracle, a force of faith sweeping everything away. But historians see more concrete factors at play. The rapid conquests didn't happen in a vacuum. They happened in a context where both superpowers had destroyed themselves so thoroughly that there was barely any resistance left. Finally, there's one more thing we need to address before closing this chapter. The word Jahiliyyah, or Age of Ignorance, is the term Islamic tradition uses for the pre-Islamic era. But this word can be misleading, because in reality, pre-Islamic Arabia was not a land of intellectual or spiritual darkness. It was a land of religious diversity, a poetic culture so vibrant it was celebrated even in the post-Islamic era, and a population already familiar with monotheism through its Jewish, Christian, and Hanif communities. In a land where Jews and Christians had lived alongside Arabs for centuries, in a world where the idea of one God wasn't a novelty but part of daily life, a movement was born. But the question historians face is this: was that movement a brand new religion that separated itself from everything that came before? Or was it something broader than that, something more ambiguous, something that might force us to rethink everything we thought we knew about the origins of Islam? In the Quran, the holy scripture of Islam, there's one word that appears over and over like a heartbeat running through the entire text. That word is mu'min, or believer. It shows up nearly 1,000 times throughout the scripture. But the word Muslim, the name that followers of Islam use to identify themselves today, appears fewer than 75 times. Think about that. Nearly 1,000 versus fewer than 75. Why is there such a massive difference in the words chosen? And what does it tell us about the true identity of the movement that the Prophet Muhammad founded? This question didn't come from a critic of religion. It came from a historian who dedicated his life to studying early Islam. His name is Fred Donner, Peter B. Ritzma Professor of Near Eastern History at the University of Chicago, one of the world's leading scholars in this field. In 2010, Donner published a book that changed how academics think about the origins of Islam. The book was called Muhammad and the Believers, published by Harvard University Press. Donner's core theory is straightforward, but it challenges everything we're used to. He proposed that what the Prophet Muhammad founded was not a new religion in the sense we understand today. It wasn't a faith that drew a hard line between itself and Judaism and Christianity from day one. What the Prophet founded was a religious reform movement that Donner calls the Believers' Movement. This movement had 2 core principles. First, strict belief in one God, no exceptions. Second, living a righteous life according to God's commands. Anyone who held to these 2 principles was a believer. And here's where Donner's theory makes you stop and think. Because according to this theory, in the earliest period, the Believers' Movement did not sharply separate itself from Christians and Jews. Christians who lived righteously and believed in one God could be part of this movement. Jews who held to the same principles could too, because they also believed in one God. Donner didn't pull this theory out of thin air. He based it on evidence from the Quran itself. The Quran contains multiple passages that refer to the al-Kitab, the people of the book, meaning Christians and Jews, in a positive light. Some verses explicitly state that among the people of the book there are true believers who will receive their reward from God just like Muslims. If this theory is correct, it completely changes the picture of early Islam. From a religion that declared itself the only path to salvation from the very first day, to an open movement that welcomed anyone who believed in one God and lived righteously, whether Muslim, Christian, or Jewish. But Donner didn't just have Quranic text. He also had physical evidence. Evidence that doesn't speak, but tells its story through its silence. Think about coins. In the ancient world, coins weren't just currency. They were the state's billboards. They told you who the ruler was, what they believed in, and what they wanted people to know. The coins of the early Caliphate, before 685 CE, had almost no Islamic content at all. Many coins were near copies of Byzantine and Sasanian originals, as if the new rulers simply slapped a new label on an existing system that was already running. Some had images of the Byzantine emperor, complete with a cross. They just added the word Bismillah, in the name of God. Some coins listed the ruler's title as Amir al-Mu'minin, which translates to Commander of the Believers, not Commander of the Muslims. Pause on that for a moment. Commander of the Believers, not Commander of the Muslims. That language lines up remarkably well with Donner's theory, as if in the earliest period the movement's identity hadn't been clearly defined yet, hadn't been sharply separated from other monotheistic groups. And what about the Shahada, the declaration of faith that is the very heart of Islam? There is no God but God. Muhammad is the messenger of God. The full Shahada first appeared on coins around 685 CE. That's more than 50 years after the Prophet's death. Donner asks the question, if Islam was a religion with a clear identity from the very beginning, why did it take more than half a century for its religious symbols to appear on the state's official media? And there's another piece of evidence from outsiders' eyes. Early Syriac Christian bishops wrote accounts that are surprising. One bishop wrote that the Arab conquerors not only didn't oppose Christianity, but actually praised the Christian faith, honored the clergy, and helped churches and monasteries. In many areas, the believers prayed in Christian churches, sharing the same religious spaces. Even in the early Umayyad state bureaucracy, Christians held important positions in financial administration. These images don't look like those of a religion that separated itself from everything that came before. They look like images of a movement still in the process of defining its own identity. A movement that hadn't yet drawn a hard line between us and them. There's another account that makes the picture even more complex. A text by an Armenian writer attributed to Sebios seems to suggest that the Prophet Muhammad personally participated in the conquest of Palestine, which contradicts the traditional narrative that he died 2 years before that event. It must be emphasized that this is an outsider's account, written from a limited perspective, and may result from confusion or incomplete information. But it's a good example of the ambiguity that shrouds this era. The critical question is, if this movement really started out as something open, when did it change? When did believers become Muslims? Donna proposes that the turning point came during the reign of Caliph Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan, the Umayyad ruler who reigned from 685 to 705 CE. Abd al-Malik was the one who brought massive changes to the Caliphate. He reformed the coinage system, reformed the bureaucracy, and most importantly, he began defining the boundaries of Islam more sharply. During his reign, the decision was made that only those who accepted the Quran as God's final revelation and Muhammad as the final prophet could truly be believers. That was the point where the broad believers movement gradually narrowed until it became Islam as we understand it today. Christians and Jews, who might once have been part of the movement, were now defined as outsiders, with rights as protected minorities, but no longer part of the believers. Of course, not everyone accepts Donna's theory. Patricia Crone, one of the most rigorous scholars in the field, criticized Donna for having too little direct evidence. She pointed out that his main evidence came from just a handful of Quranic verses, and the rest was interpretation from indirect evidence like coins, titles, and outsider accounts, all of which could be read multiple ways. Some Muslim scholars also disagreed. They argued that Islam defined itself clearly from the very beginning through the Quran and the Prophet's teachings. The Quran's positive references to the people of the book didn't mean they were part of the movement, but rather showed respect for other monotheistic faiths as spiritual siblings, not as fellow members. Donna himself was straightforward and humble about his theory's limitations. He once said that the traditional narrative reads like a good novel, full of captivating details, but when he reads it as a historian, it doesn't quite fit. The believer's movement concept felt more plausible to him. But he emphasized that this is just an academic proposal, not a final conclusion. Regardless of how correct Donna's theory is, there's one thing all sides agree on. No matter which school they belong to, no matter how they think Islam began, everyone acknowledges that there is one document at the heart of everything. That document is the Quran. The text that Muslims believe is the word of God, unchanged since the day it was revealed, not even by a single letter. But in 1972, workers repairing a mosque in Yemen accidentally caused a wall to collapse. What was hidden inside, more than 1,300 years old, was about to open a new window into the past, a window revealing that the process that made the Quran what it is today was far more complex than anyone had imagined. Workers were repairing a wall in the attic of the Great Mosque of Sanaa, Yemen. It was 1972. The air was hot and stifling, dust drifting through shafts of sunlight coming through the windows. They were doing routine work, expecting nothing but plaster and bricks. But then the wall collapsed, revealing a massive cache of ancient manuscripts that had been hidden between the ceiling and the roof for who knows how many centuries. Parchment and paper, crumbling and fused together by moisture and time. Those workers had no idea they'd just stumbled onto one of the most important archaeological discoveries in the history of Islam. They simply stuffed the old papers into 20 potato sacks and left them on the stairway of the minaret tower. Fortunately, someone recognized what they'd found. Ismail al-Aqwa, president of the Yemeni Antiquities Authority, understood immediately that these fragments weren't just old paper. They were pieces of Quran manuscripts that might be among the oldest in the world. He reached out to German scholars, and with funding from West Germany, a major conservation project began. led first by Gerd R. Puin, a paleographer from Saarland University, and later by Hans Caspar Graf von Bothmer, an art historian. What they found exceeded all expectations. More than 12,000 Quran manuscript fragments from over 926 distinct manuscripts. A treasure trove of knowledge hidden between the ceiling and roof of a mosque for centuries. But among those thousands of fragments, one stood out above all the rest. The manuscript scholars call Sanaa 1, or DAM 01-27.1. This manuscript is special because it's what's called a palimpsest. That's a piece of goatskin that was written on twice. In ancient times, animal skin prepared for writing was extremely expensive. It had to go through a complex process of scraping, smoothing, and treating before a single sheet was ready for use. When the original text was no longer needed, people would scrape the ink off and write new text over it. But with modern technology, especially ultraviolet light and computer processing, scholars can now read the original text that was erased. It's like seeing through time itself. The upper layer of this manuscript, the text written over it later, matches the standard Quran used today in every detail. The same words, the same order of surahs or chapters. No surprises there. But the lower layer, the original text that was erased and written over, is a completely different story. Behnam Sadeghi, professor of Islamic studies at Stanford University, and Mohsen Goodarzi from Harvard University published a detailed study in 2012. They found that the text in the lower layer differs from the standard version in multiple places. Some words are changed, some sentences are arranged differently, and most importantly, the order of the surahs doesn't match any known arrangement. Sadeghi called this lower text the only known surviving copy from a textual tradition other than the Uthmanic one. That means, in the very earliest period of Islam, there were versions of the Quran text circulating that differed from the standard version. But before you get excited or alarmed, you need to understand the context properly. Muslim scholars point out that these differences are nothing new. Muslim scholars of the past documented long ago that before Caliph Uthman compiled the standard version, there were multiple different readings of the Quran, called qira'at. Several of the Prophet's companions had personal copies that weren't identical in every detail. Caliph Uthman compiled the standard version specifically to end these differences and ordered all other versions destroyed. The lower text of the Sanaa manuscript may be one of the copies that escaped that order. And here's another crucial point. Sadeghi himself concluded that the Uthmanic version, the standard text, is likely the closest to the original, because most of the differences in the lower layer appear to be copying errors, not deliberate changes to the content. The Sanaa manuscript isn't alone. In recent decades, several other ancient Quran manuscripts have been discovered that help fill in the picture. The Birmingham Quran manuscript is one of the most exciting discoveries in Quran studies. It had been kept at the University of Birmingham in England for decades, part of the Mingana collection assembled back in the 1920s, without anyone knowing how old it really was. Then it was sent for carbon-14 dating at the University of Oxford laboratory. The results stunned everyone. The goatskin it was written on dated to between 568 and 645 CE, with a confidence level of 95.4%. That means the animal whose skin was used to write this manuscript may have been alive during the lifetime of the Prophet Muhammad himself, who lived from roughly 570 to 632 CE. And the text of the Birmingham manuscript is virtually identical to the Quran used today. Bart Ehrman, the famous New Testament scholar who has spent his career studying Bible manuscripts, expressed astonishment at the consistency of Quran transmission. He pointed out that for the New Testament, the oldest manuscript fragments we have were written roughly 170 years after Jesus' death. But for the Quran, we have manuscripts potentially written within a few decades of the Prophet's death, and the text is virtually unchanged from the current version. The Tübingen manuscript from Germany is another piece confirming the antiquity. Carbon-14 dating at the Kiel laboratory placed it in the range of 649 to 675 CE, with a 68% confidence level, consistent with the era of the caliphs who directly succeeded the Prophet. But before accepting these numbers without question, you need to understand an important limitation of carbon-14 dating. First, carbon-14 dates the goat skin, not the ink. It tells you when the animal died, not when the text was written. The skin could have been prepared years or even decades before it was used for writing. Second, results from different laboratories sometimes differ significantly. For the Sanaa 1 manuscript, labs in Lyon, France, in Kiel, Germany, in Zurich, Switzerland, and in Oxford, England, produced results that didn't match. Some gave dates decades older than others, with the widest range stretching from the late 6th to the mid-7th century. These discrepancies remind us that carbon-14 is not a tool that gives 100% certain answers. It's an approximation with a margin of error, and it needs to be interpreted alongside other evidence, not used as a final answer on its own. Even so, despite these limitations, these ancient manuscripts taken together tell us several important things. First, the Quran is genuinely ancient. Multiple manuscripts can be dated to the 7th century CE, within the lifetimes of the Prophet's contemporaries or shortly after. Second, the text of the standard version, the Uthmanic text, is remarkably consistent. Ancient manuscripts from multiple continents, whether from Yemen, England, or Germany, all contain text virtually identical to the Quran used today. That level of consistency is extremely rare for ancient documents. And third, the Sanaa 1 manuscript shows that before the standard version was compiled, there really were different versions of the Quran text in circulation. The process that made the Quran what it is today wasn't something that happened overnight. It was a complex process in which human beings played a role in selecting, compiling, and standardizing. These manuscripts don't destroy the Quran. In many ways, they confirm its antiquity and the consistency of its text. But what they reveal is a process more complex than the simple picture many are familiar with. The picture that says the text was preserved perfectly from the very first moment without any variation whatsoever. The reality appears to be more nuanced than that. There was both continuity and change, both preservation and selection. But manuscripts aren't the only evidence that era left behind. There's another voice from the past that speaks just as clearly, a voice that doesn't come from ink on animal skin, but from metal hammered into shape, from stone carved with inscriptions, and from gold gleaming above one of the holiest cities on earth. Imagine you're holding an old copper coin in your hand, a coin minted in the 7th century. Smaller than a quarter, its surface rough with age. On one side, there's an image of a Byzantine emperor holding an orb and a cross. Looks no different from a coin minted in Constantinople. But flip it over, and there's an Arabic inscription that says, Bismillah. That's it, nothing else. No mention of Muhammad, no Shahada, nothing we would call Islamic today. But this coin was minted by the Caliphate during a period when history tells us Islam was conquering the world. In the ancient world, coins weren't just money. They were the state's billboards. They were the message rulers sent to every citizen who bought and sold in the marketplace. Coins told you who was in charge, what they believed, and what they wanted you to know. That's why historians give coins so much weight as evidence. They were minted in that era in real time. They weren't written after the fact. The story of early Islamic coinage is fascinating because it tells a story different from what we'd expect. Before 685 CE, the Caliphate's coins were essentially copies of Byzantine and Sasanian originals. In Syria and Egypt, coins had images of Byzantine emperors, complete with crosses. In Iraq and Iran, coins had images of Sasanian kings with sacred Zoroastrian fire altars. The new rulers just added the word Bismillah or the title Amir al-Mu'minin, as if they were running the existing system and didn't yet feel the need to clearly declare their own religious identity. So when did the turning point come? Around 685 CE, the words Muhammad Rasul Allah, or Muhammad is the messenger of God, appeared on a coin for the first time. That coin was minted in the city of Bishapur in Iran, under the authority of Ibn al-Zubair, who at the time was the political rival of the Umayyad dynasty. It's interesting that the clearest religious symbol of Islam first appeared not from the center of power, but from a faction competing against the center of power, as if declaring religious identity was also a political tool at the same time. The full Shahada first appeared on a coin around 691 CE, from a coin minted in Sistan in eastern Iran. That's nearly 60 years after the Prophet's death. But the biggest change came under Caliph Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan around 696 to 697 CE. Abd al-Malik reformed the entire coinage system. From coins copying foreign designs, they became fully Islamic coins. No more human images, only text, the Shahada and verses from the Quran. The new coins declared religious identity beyond any doubt. From coins, let's move to stone. Rock inscriptions in the Arabian desert number in the thousands. Many were carved during the 7th and 8th centuries. Archaeologists Yehuda D. Nevo and Judith Crone studied these inscriptions and found something interesting. Many of them contain content that is generically monotheistic, mentioning one God, asking for blessings, but not identifying as specifically Islamic. No mention of Muhammad, no Shahada. As if the people who carved these inscriptions saw themselves as believers in one God, without yet defining themselves as Muslim in the sense we understand. Meanwhile, a tombstone from the city of Aswan in Egypt, dated to year 71 of the Islamic calendar, roughly 690 CE, is one of the earliest known inscriptions to include the Shahada. Once again, the Shahada appears in the late 7th century, not the mid-7th. All the evidence points to the same period. the reign of Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan, as the turning point when Islamic identity was officially declared. And no piece of evidence declares that identity louder than the building Abd al-Malik constructed on top of one of the holiest hills in the world. The Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem was completed around 691 to 692 CE. It's one of the oldest surviving Islamic buildings, still in complete condition today. An octagonal structure with a golden dome adorned with blue glazed tiles standing tall on the Haram al-Sharif, the site Jews call the Temple Mount, where King Solomon's temple once stood before Roman armies destroyed it in 70 CE. This site is sacred to all three monotheistic religions. Inside the Dome of the Rock runs an inscription stretching 240 meters along the interior walls. This inscription contains the oldest Quranic verses still surviving in an architectural context. It includes the Shahada, the Bismillah, and most importantly, text that explicitly rejects the Christian doctrine of the Trinity. It reads, "God does not beget, nor is he begotten." This wasn't just a mosque being built, this was a declaration of theological war. In a city that was the spiritual center of both Christianity and Judaism, Abd al-Malik built a monument that proclaimed, "Our religion has arrived, and we are not like you." But scholars noticed another interesting detail. The inscriptions inside the Dome of the Rock have slight differences from the standard Quran text. For example, some passages shift from first person to third person. These differences are small, but significant. They suggest that even in the late 7th century, the Quran text may not yet have been completely standardized in every detail. And there's a fascinating case of political forgery as well. In the inscription, the name of Abd al-Malik, the man who actually built the Dome of the Rock, was erased and replaced with the name of al-Ma'mun, an Abbasid caliph who reigned about 100 years later, from 813 to 833 CE. But whoever made the change forgot to alter the date. The inscription still reads year 72 of the Islamic calendar, which corresponds to Abd al-Malik's reign, not al-Ma'mun's. This clumsy forgery was first noticed by the French scholar Melchior de Vogue back in 1864. Proof that even religious monuments aren't immune to politics. Why did Abd al-Malik build the Dome of the Rock? Scholars offer several explanations. Some suggest he built it to compete with the Kaaba in Mecca, which at that time was controlled by his political rival Ibn al-Zubayr. If you don't control Mecca, build a new center. Though this theory has been questioned by scholars who point out that evidence of Muslims stopping their pilgrimage to Mecca during this period is very thin. Some suggest he built it to proclaim Islam's victory over Christianity and Judaism in a city sacred to all three religions. Building a structure more magnificent than any church on the very site of the Temple of Jerusalem was the most powerful statement he could make. And some suggest he built it to define Islam's identity more sharply, to formally separate from Christianity through inscriptions that reject the Trinity head-on. If the Believers movement had previously been ambiguous about what it actually was, the Dome of the Rock was the point where that ambiguity ended. The truth is probably a mix of all of the above: politics, religion, competition, and identity building, all woven together so tightly they can't be separated. The Dome of the Rock, the coins, the stone inscriptions, the tombstones. They all point to the same period, the late 7th century, the reign of Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan, as the moment of transition. From a relatively open believers movement with an unclear identity, to an Islam that defined itself clearly, that declared itself distinct from Christianity and Judaism, that had its own symbols, its own coins, its own monuments. Political power and religious identity were woven together so tightly they couldn't be separated. The history of early Islam, seen through these physical artifacts, isn't only a story of faith, it's also a story of power, of rulers who had to decide how to define themselves, where to draw the lines, and how to build an identity distinct from everything that came before. But when this evidence was revealed to the public, some people read it much further than the evidence warranted. So far that they crossed the thin line between evidence-based academic discovery and groundless imagination. In 2017, a Canadian explorer named Dan Gibson published a book claiming that every mosque built in the first 100 years of Islam faced the city of Petra in Jordan, not Mecca in Saudi Arabia. If that were true, it would change everything we know about the origins of a religion with nearly 2 billion followers. It would mean that Islam's holiest city isn't Mecca, but Petra, the ancient city carved from pink sandstone cliffs in the Jordanian desert. A tourist destination, not a pilgrimage site. But is it true? And more importantly, how do we tell the difference between a genuine discovery and a theory that sounds great but has no foundation? Gibson claimed he used GPS to measure the Qibla direction of dozens of ancient mosques and found that most of them pointed toward Petra, not Mecca. Sounds like solid evidence. Numbers don't lie. The mosque faces where it faces. How can you argue with that? But David A. King, an expert on Islamic astronomy who has studied Qibla determination for decades, identified a fundamental flaw in Gibson's reasoning. The flaw is this. Gibson compared the orientations of ancient mosques with the modern directions to Petra and Mecca without understanding how early Muslims actually determined the Qibla. Think about it. In the 7th century, there was no GPS, no satellite maps, no spherical trigonometry, no accurate geographic coordinates. Early Muslims couldn't point a building toward a specific spot on the Earth's surface with any precision because they didn't have the tools to do it. They didn't even know what latitude and longitude Mecca was at because that coordinate system wasn't yet in widespread use. So what did they do? King explains that early Muslims used what's called folk astronomy, observing celestial phenomena with the naked eye. The positions of sunrise and sunset through the seasons, the position of the North Star, wind directions. These were the tools they used to approximate the direction of the Kaaba in Mecca. And interestingly, the Kaaba itself is astronomically aligned. Each of its walls corresponds to the rising and setting of the sun at different seasons. So early Muslims weren't trying to face the city of Mecca, they were trying to face the Kaaba, using celestial phenomena associated with the building itself. The result is that mosques in Iraq generally face west, following the winter sunset. Mosques in Egypt generally face east. Both were ways of approximating the Kaaba's direction based on the knowledge of the era. They weren't pointing at Petra on purpose. The fact that these directions happen to coincide with the modern direction of Petra is because Petra sits along the route from many locations toward Mecca, not because the mosques were built to face Petra. King emphasized that before roughly the 9th century, when Muslim mathematicians began developing methods to calculate the Qibla using spherical trigonometry, no civilization on Earth could orient a building toward a specific point on the globe with any accuracy. Gibson's claim that early Muslims could aim their mosques at Petra with pinpoint precision from thousands of miles away amounts to claiming they had technology that no one in the world had yet invented. The Gibson case is an important lesson. Not every exciting-sounding discovery survives academic scrutiny. Numbers may not lie, but the interpretation of numbers absolutely can, if the interpreter doesn't understand the full context. In an age where information spreads at lightning speed across the internet, a theory that looks convincing on a screen can collapse the moment it faces an expert who's studied the subject for a lifetime. The difference between an amateur researcher and a professional scholar isn't enthusiasm. It's the depth of understanding of the context. Now, let's step back and look at the big picture. After traveling through all of this, from the source problem to the pre-Islamic world, to the believers' movement, to the ancient manuscripts, the coins, the inscriptions, and the debunked theories, what do scholars actually agree on? First, the Prophet Muhammad was a real historical person. Even the most hardline revisionist scholars like Patricia Crone never denied his existence, contrary to what many people wrongly believe. Second, the Quran is a 7th century document. Multiple ancient manuscripts confirm this, and the text is remarkably consistent compared to other sacred scriptures in history. Third, the Arab conquests of the 7th century really happened. Contemporary evidence from all sides confirms this. Fourth, the later Islamic literary sources contain valuable information but must be used carefully. Just like any ancient source, no serious historian would throw them out entirely, but no one would accept them entirely without questions either. This is the common ground, the ground where most scholars stand, regardless of which camp they lean toward. But at the same time, there are many things scholars still don't agree on, and these debates are still going strong. They're still arguing about how much of the Prophet's life can be accessed through the available sources. What can we actually know about him beyond the broad outline that he lived, taught monotheism, and founded a movement that changed the world? They haven't settled on when Islam as a religion distinct from Christianity and Judaism actually emerged, whether during the Prophet's own lifetime or decades later during the reign of Abd al-Malik. And they're still debating exactly when the Quran was compiled into a standard version, during Caliph Uthman's time, as the traditional narrative states, or as a gradual process over a much longer period. Robert Hoyland proposed a middle way. Use contemporary evidence as the framework, then carefully fill in details from the Islamic sources. He compared it to building a house. Contemporary evidence is the foundation and structure. Islamic sources are the furniture and decoration. Both are necessary, but they have to come in the right order. Munim Siri of the University of Notre Dame, in his book Controversies over Islamic Origins, published in 2021, tried to find common ground between the different camps. He showed that traditionalists and revisionists actually share more than they think. Both sides accept that studying the origins of Islam is complex. Both accept that no single source is perfect. And both accept that constructive debate is the only way our understanding moves forward. And Fred Donner himself, the man who proposed the believers' movement theory, summed up his own position with honesty and humility. He said, The traditional narrative reads like a great novel, full of fascinating details. But when he reads it as a historian, it doesn't quite add up. The Believers' Movement concept feels more plausible to him, but he didn't claim to have the final answer. He knows well that in this field, certainty is a luxury that's almost impossible to have. Maybe the most important thing this entire debate teaches us isn't specifically about Islam. It's about how human beings understand their own past. Every religion, every civilization, every nation has a story about its own origins. Those stories are enormously valuable. They give meaning, direction, and a sense of belonging to something greater than yourself. But stories and history aren't always the same thing. And acknowledging that difference doesn't make the stories lose their value. Studying the history of a religion is not destroying faith. It's acknowledging that faith and history stand on different ground. Faith asks, what does this mean? History asks, what happened? These two questions don't contradict each other, they simply look from different angles. And both can coexist, just as the moon and the sun coexist in the same sky. The history of Islam isn't a puzzle that needs to be solved. It's an ongoing conversation. A conversation between evidence, faith, and human imagination. A conversation that started more than 1400 years ago and shows no sign of ending. Every time an archaeologist uncovers a new inscription in the desert, every time new technology lets us read erased text on ancient goatskin, every time a scholar dares to ask a question nobody has asked before, that conversation takes one more step forward. History never tells a story to the end. It simply stops talking when the evidence runs out. But the truth is still waiting, buried beneath the vast sands. It may be 100 years or 1,000 before someone digs it up.